the Warden of Tor Ivres.
Hey guys, Michael here. Hope that you're all doing great today. When I started posting some videos recently about Warhammer 3 and the status of it and the fact that I'm still having fun with it, and obviously to a certain extent I've been defending it because I do think it's gotten a little bit too much in the way of criticism recently, although I've always pointed out that the criticism is quite fair, but there's still an awful lot to like about the game. Anyway, there has been a recurring comment that has happened over and over again, and that is that Warhammer 2 was a better game than Warhammer 3. And I've got to say, I understand where you're coming from when you say that. So in this video, what we are going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about Warhammer 2 and Warhammer 3 and settle the age-old question that philosophers and scientists have been trying to solve for hundreds of years about which of these two games is better. Okay, maybe not, but what I will do is I will tell you at least what my thoughts are. And obviously, this is going to come down to some combination of objectivity and subjectivity. So here's how I'm going to start out talking about this. I'm going to start out talking about something completely different, but I think it'll make sense. When somebody asks me what is the best movie ever made, my answer is The Shawshank Redemption. Great movie. Objectively great movie. But when somebody asks me what my favorite movie is, my answer is Star Wars. And also a great movie, but in many ways objectively not as good of a movie. So why would I say that? Well, there's nothing in The Shawshank Redemption, as great as it is, there's nothing in The Shawshank Redemption that gives me the same visceral reaction, and particularly the first time I saw these movies, there's nothing that gave me the same visceral reaction that I got from watching Luke blow up the Death Star, for example. Okay, there's just a subjective element when we're talking about these things where you have to bring in how did it make you feel. So obviously when we're talking about the word better or best, it's kind of open to some interpretation, but that's how I interpret it, is that there's a little bit of subjectivity and basically more or less what is your visceral reaction, what are your personal preferences that weigh greater than the objective things that most people would use to evaluate either a movie or a game. So let's bring that example back then and compare it here to Warhammer 2 and Warhammer 3. Now, Warhammer 2 has an awful lot going for it. It was absolutely a great game. I'm not going to argue with anybody who says that they think that Warhammer 2 was the better game. There were fewer issues that popped up, although I will point out there were issues along the way in Warhammer 2. They did a pretty good job of fixing those along the way, and some of the reworks and DLCs and things that came out for Warhammer 2 really vastly improved that game from when it first came out until the time that it was done, quote unquote done, and then Warhammer 3 came out. But if you talk about, for example, all the different factions that were in Warhammer 2 and of course are now in Warhammer 3 as well, some of the best factions in the game have been coming from Warhammer 2. So let's just talk about that for a second, because there's a lot of different ways to kind of parse out this particular comparison between the two games. And Warhammer 3 is obviously just a bigger game than Warhammer 2 is, and that is definitely something that most people would say is a positive in its favor, although again you could probably make the argument the other way. But so there's probably no race in Warhammer 2 I think that better epitomizes the quality of that game and one of the better races in that game than the Skaven. That was a Warhammer 2 introduction, and then they continued to add to it, and they did a lot of really good work when it came to the Skaven, but obviously there's lots of other races. Some of them carry over from Warhammer 1, but we're not talking about Warhammer 1 in this discussion, because I don't think very many people would argue that Warhammer 1 is the best game of the three. But so you have the Skaven, and the Skaven are really the shining example of the variety of different legendary lords within the same faction, probably unsurpassed even to this day. There's no single faction that gives you as much variety of mechanics and play styles as what the Skaven do. And again, that's a Warhammer 2 invention. But then you've got, going across the board, I'm going to go ahead and include the Warhammer 1 races in this list, but these are all the races that were available in Warhammer 2. You've got the Empire, the Tomb Kings, the Warriors of Chaos, Norska, Dark Elves, High Elves, Bretonnia, Beastmen, Vampire Coast, the Dwarves, Lizardmen, Greenskins, Vampire Counts, and finally the Wood Elves. And there's some really, really good races in there, obviously, with some really good mechanics, but there's a lot missing. And this is really now where I'm going to bring the discussion back to Warhammer 3 and what is so good about Warhammer 3. I'm a Nurgle guy, always have been, really love Nurgle, but Nurgle is not the only addition, obviously, in Warhammer 3. Kislev is a great addition. Cathay is a good addition. All of your demonic races, which I think are now, it would be hard to go back and play a game of Warhammer without the additional demonic factions in the game at this point. These are really good additions to the game. Now, none of them reach the level of Skaven in terms of the variety of mechanics and maybe the ultimate polish that Warhammer 2 had that Warhammer 3 doesn't have. And we haven't even talked about things like the battles and the sieges. And don't get me wrong, people were complaining about sieges in Warhammer 2 as well, because there were a lot of flaws in Warhammer 2. And we'd have to talk about what game has the best sieges. You've got to go back to some of the historical titles. It's really kind of amazing that they have really screwed up sieges in Warhammer Total War as much as they have. Because sieges, there's nothing better than a really good siege battle, and it's just appalling that they have allowed the status of sieges to get to where they are. But anyway, the acknowledgement is there that there was some polish, there were some mechanics that did work better in Warhammer 2. The AI was better in Warhammer 2. The AI provided a better the higher difficulty provided a better challenge in the second game than it does in the third game. And we're not talking about mods here. Obviously, there's mods that can kind of alter some of these things as well. But in Warhammer 3, despite it being a step back in some ways, and the AI is obviously a significant one, the sieges and the bugs are obviously a significant one, it would be really, really hard to play the game now without the demonic factions. So my Star Wars example, I think here's where that comes back in, which is there's a visceral experience that I get, and I think a lot of other people get as well, not just from playing the demons, but from just encountering them in the game. They add some, a new element to the gameplay that wasn't there before. And for me, that's enough to push Warhammer 3 ahead of Warhammer 2 overall when I say which is the better game. But again, somewhat open to interpretation what you mean by better. Also, when you think back about some of those races from the second game, some of them have gotten reworks during the time of Warhammer 3 that have made them better. Now, we could talk about dwarfs, and I know some people would argue that the dwarf rework was actually a step in the wrong direction. I won't disagree with you. I kind of honestly preferred the old grudge system better than the Age of Reckoning system and the collection of just hundreds and hundreds of grudges, by an army or by a settlement. I mean, it's fine the way it is, but I kind of preferred it the old way. I kind of liked that old mechanic of your book of grudges growing, and you had to, you had very specific objectives to have to go back and resolve. But I don't mind the Age of Reckoning system, and I do really think that the deep road system that they introduced for the dwarfs is really, really nice. I think that's a really good addition for them. And obviously, we talked about some of these other factions as well that have gotten some reworks in the last couple of years during the time of Warhammer 3 as well that have improved them. I don't think too many people are going to say that Norska is where it should be right now. Thank good they're including it in Tides of Torment. But Norska, kind of got a boost when Warhammer 3 came out. I mean, it was bad, and then it was better, and then it went back to being bad again, and then it got a little better again. But anyway, these things are obviously a little bit up and down. So I don't think that Warhammer 3 for me wins out wins by a landslide. I think it maybe wins the race by a nose. But I'm curious what other people think. Obviously, like I said, this comes down to some combination of subjectivity and objectivity, and how much do you personally weight your own subjectivity above the objectivity of a game having fewer flaws than another. But anyway, I think I'll go ahead and leave it at that. Hopefully, this will generate some interesting discussion. I'm kind of curious what your guys' opinions are on this. I don't think there's a right or a wrong answer, although I have no doubt that there will be people who will just flat out come out and tell me that I'm an idiot and that I'm wrong. There always are. And that's fine. That's part of creating YouTube videos. But I think we'll get some good discussion to go with that as well. And of course, we do have the upcoming reworks for the races that are involved in Tides of Torment, and that'll change the equation a little bit more. I do think that if Tides of Torment is a failure, if it's just if it's like Thrones of Decay, then Thrones of Decay? Yeah, Thrones of Decay. If it's like Thrones of Decay, I think we will all celebrate. I think that would be a really positive sign. If it's closer to Shadows of Change, I think maybe the game is doomed, except for the modding community being able to sustain it for a while. And if it's like Omens of Destruction, I think that's not going to be a great sign either. The Omens of Destruction was an okay DLC, but it had so many flaws in it that it would, and the fact that they really never got addressed, or at least some of them never got addressed, the ones that I care about never got addressed. That's going to be kind of a dead giveaway where this game is going moving forward. But anyway, that's starting to speculate at that point. Let me bring it back to the main topic, of course, which is, what do you think? Which and you could. There's absolutely nothing wrong with saying subjectively you think that Warhammer 2 is better, because maybe you don't care about the demons, maybe you don't like Cathay or Kislev. So absolutely nothing wrong with saying that Warhammer 2 gave you a greater visceral reaction than anything that happens in Warhammer 3. I'm just letting you know from my own perspective. That's my case. I think it would be hard to play Warhammer Total War now without the demons, and part of that is because I do really like the flavor of the demons, and in particular Nurgle, although I like all of them. All right, anyway, I'll go ahead and leave it at that. Thanks as always for watching and listening, and I'll see you guys in the next video.
A reckoning! We must not be blinded by our own need for power. This is the moment. Your choices will decide the fate of this world. And all that inhabit it. Make the right one!